Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event, Is Civil Discourse Dead? A conversation with Robert George and Cornel West. My name is Scott Powell, and I'm the director of the Aquinas Institute for Catholic Thought here at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And I'm going to be your host and your moderator for this evening. I want to begin, first of all, by thanking our good friends at the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization, Thought, and Policy here at the University of Colorado, and the CU Center for Leadership for their generous help in hosting tonight's event. I am thrilled that we have this partnership with the university because ultimately the mission of the Aquinas Institute is to engage the University of Colorado and the greater community. And tonight that community is very great as we have so many of you listening from all over the country and really all over the globe. But to engage the greater community with the rich and ancient voice of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Too often, I think people of faith become siloed in their own faith communities and they fail to enter into the broader societal conversation. We love the plurality and the diversity of the University of Colorado, and we are thrilled and honored to be able to add the unique voice and worldview of our church as we debate, as we discuss, and we wrestle with the problems of the day. So that's our mission here. That's what we do. Now, tonight's event is in a lot of ways in honor of the upcoming feast of our patron, St. Thomas Aquinas. And part of the reason for that is that Thomas, who lived in the 1200s, which by the way, was a time of great political and intellectual upheaval, he wasn't afraid of discourse. He wasn't afraid of debate, of argument. He was concerned with truth and in finding it, no matter where it was hidden. He was known at the University of Paris, where he spent much of his life, as a person who was willing to engage with anyone and everyone on matters like theology and philosophy and culture. And so as we enter into this discussion tonight, I hope that he would be proud to have his name associated with this event. Now, for tonight, we are so excited. There are so many of you. We had over 1,200 people register for this event, and we are so excited that, again, you are joining us from all over the place. I know people are coming from literally all over the globe to join us virtually. On some level, I wish we could be doing this in person, that we could be sitting face to face and actually sharing this event together. But in other ways, we are able to welcome so many people into this conversation that would not otherwise be able to be here. And so we're so grateful for that and the hugeness of this event, which tells us a lot about what folks are seeking, what we're wanting. Despite what social media and the news and everything tells us, I think a lot of us do want reconciliation. We want civility. We want to be able to speak with one another. So this is an exciting event. And to be honest with you, I have written and rewritten again my intro for this evening. So when we first conceived of this idea early in the summer, we knew things were bad, but I don't think that most of us knew quite how bad they were. So the events of the summer, the election, the chaos at the US Capitol just a few weeks ago, I think in a lot of ways has exposed something that has existed in our country for a very long time. And we are now seeing manifest the deep brokenness of our societies, of our cities, of our neighborhoods, and even our families. And some people have asked us in the lead up to this event, why as a religious institution are you holding an event that sounds political? And of course, it's not really political. It's not merely political. And the Christian tradition, which is what we come from, is in the business of trying to foster reconciliation out of brokenness. That's been the mission from the beginning, from the brokenness in our relationship with our Creator, to the brokenness inside of ourselves, to the broken relationships with our neighbors, and ultimately our relationship with the whole world. That's the mission of the church, to try to bring reconciliation to what is broken. And so in light of that, tonight we want to have a conversation about brokenness and hopefully about reconciliation. And I can't think of two people who are better suited to engage in this question than our guests tonight. These are two men who seek the truth, who challenge leaders, who challenge their universities, structures, the status quo, who both share a love for Jesus, but who both see the world and who see the answer to our societal problems in very different ways. They disagree about much, but I think they both recognize in each other a shared humanity. They share a reverence for one another. I've been a little nervous about this event, and someone sent me a text just before we started that said, hey, don't forget to enjoy yourself tonight. And so with all the details and so many people joining us tonight, I'd sort of forgotten to enjoy myself. And then Professor George and Professor West popped onto the Zoom call, and they've just been laughing and sharing their lives and their families and the sheer joy that these two men share out of the sheer goodness of being with each other is an inspiration in and of itself. And so let me introduce you to them. First of all, I want to introduce Dr. Cornel West. Dr. West is professor of the practice of public philosophy at Harvard University and holds the title of Professor Emeritus at Princeton University. He's also taught at Union Theological Seminary, at Yale, Harvard, and the University of Paris. Cornel West graduated magna cum laude from Harvard in 3 years, and he obtained his MA and PhD in philosophy at Princeton. He has written 20 books and he's edited another 13. He's best known for his classics, Race Matters and Democracy Matters, his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud, and his most recent book, Black Prophetic Fire. Dr. West is a frequent guest on the Bill Maher Show, the Colbert Report, CNN, C-SPAN, and Democracy Now! And I think he just finished an interview a couple minutes before coming on our event tonight. He's also made his film debut in The Matrix, and he was actually the commentator along with Ken Wilber on the official trilogy that was released on The Matrix. He has appeared in over 25 documentary films, and he's produced 3 spoken word albums, including Never Forget. He's collaborated with artists like Prince, Jill Scott, Andre 3000, and many others. So in short, Cornel West has a passion to communicate through a vast variety of media in order to tell the truth and to bear witness to love and justice. Our second guest, Dr. Robert P. George, is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and the Director of the James Madison Program and American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He has served as chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, on the President's Council on Bioethics, and as a presidential appointee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He's a former judicial fellow at the Supreme Court, a graduate of Swarthmore College. He holds advanced degrees from Harvard, the University of Oxford. He's been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School and is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He's the author of many books, including Making Men Moral, Civil Liberties and Public Morality, In Defense of Natural Law, The Clash of Orthodoxies, Embryo, A Defense of Human Life, and What is Marriage? Professor George is the recipient of many honors and awards, including the U.S. Presidential Citizens Medal and Princeton University's President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. He has given honorific lectures at Harvard, Yale, the University of St. Andrews, Oxford University, Cornell. He's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and holds 21, you heard that right, 21 honorary degrees, including honorary doctorates of law, ethics, science, letters, divinity, humanities, law and moral values, civil law, humane letters, and judicial science. So these men are leading thinkers in our world, in our society. They're good friends. They share a love for each other. And so without further ado, I want to welcome and thank Professor Robert George and Professor Cornel West for being here with us tonight. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And I should note that, of course, I edited and trimmed down your bios significantly because there's a lot there. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for all the work that you've contributed to the body of knowledge in our society. And thanks for being with us. Again, I can't tell you how honored I am to be sharing at least a screen with both of you. So thank you again. To jump in tonight, so I want to start, and I have a number of questions that I want to propose to you to spark some conversation, some dialogue, and at the end, we have a couple of questions that have come in from our audience members that I also want to propose to you. But to begin with, I wonder if you'd both begin by just taking a few minutes to tell us a bit about how your friendship began. And part of the reason I think this is such an important question is I think it's unfortunate that many people see your friendship perhaps as an anomaly. It's kind of an oddity because you disagree on so many things. But at the same time, in promoting this event and talking to people about why this is important, I think a lot of people thought it was interesting to talk about civil discourse and they thought the topic was fascinating. But so many more folks wanted to hear you both talk about it because a lot of people can talk about the concept, but it's your relationship and the way that you actually live out that civil discourse that people wanted to hear from. So if you would you tell us a bit about how this friendship started, where it came from?
Shall I begin?
And maybe Professor George.
Brother Robbie.
Thank you. Scott, first, let me say on behalf of Cornel and myself, just how honored we are to be with you. We admire the work of the Aquinas Institute. at the University of Colorado. We admire the university. It's one of the great state universities, one of the great universities in our country, both as a research institution and as a teaching institution. I am also a big supporter of the Benson Center and of my dear friend Shiloh Brooks out there at the Benson Center and the others who are involved in the Benson Center. I had the honor of being consulted by President Benson when he was putting together the Benson Center and forming the idea. And I love the work that the center's doing. I also, of course, want to thank the leadership, the Center for Leadership, for its co-sponsorship this evening. And what a blessing it is to be together again, even if only virtually, with my beloved friend, Cornel West. Cornel is America's leading public intellectual. It's an honor for me just to be able to be in conversation with him, in public dialogue with him so often. I'll tell you a little bit about how our relationship began and developed. But the key thing that I want to say about the relationship is at its heart is mutual respect and admiration and esteem. Certainly speaking for myself, I love my brother Cornel West because he is a truth seeker. He and I may disagree in many cases, although we also agree on a lot of things about where the truth is, what the truth is, but he's a truth seeker. He cares more about truth than his own opinions. He doesn't invest so heavily emotionally in his own opinions or ideology that he loses sight of truth. And he's willing, in an exemplary manner, to consider the best arguments available for positions that are contrary to his own. Not only is he willing to be unsettled and challenged by criticism, he welcomes it, he wants it. And behind that's a deep humanity, which involves a recognition of one's own fallibility. And let me tell you something, if someone is brilliant and learned as Cornel West is willing to acknowledge his fallibility, well, then the rest of us ought to be able and willing to acknowledge ours. And that means listening to people who disagree with you, not just about the superficial and trivial things, but about deep, important things, even our most cherished identity-forming beliefs. Now, this relationship began in a lovely way, I think. So Cornel arrived at Princeton just a few years after I did. He was a little more senior than I was, and he had already developed a big reputation by the time he got to Princeton. But he arrived a little after I did. So by the early 1990s, we were both at Princeton together. I didn't yet have tenure. I think Cornel did. And we got to know each other originally, not well, but got to know each other a bit when we were together in faculty graduate student seminars run by the Center for Human Values at Princeton, which is a philosophically oriented sort of internal think tank and teaching institution within Princeton University, a great institution. Now, then, and probably true today, most of our colleagues were what I hope you won't interpret this term pejoratively, were standard, conventional, mainstream, liberal academic thinkers. And neither Cornel nor I was that. He was to their left, I was to their right. He was the radical and I was the conservative. Now, the mainstream of liberal political theory, certainly in those days, was built on the idea that in making politically important decisions about legislation and about policy, about institutions and about the principles that will govern us, law and the state ought to be, to the extent possible, neutral about core moral questions, values questions, neutral with respect to questions of what makes for or detracts from a valuable and morally worthy way of life. The great thinker in this tradition, to whom everyone was responding, was John Rawls of Harvard. Now, neither Cornel nor I, while deeply respectful of that tradition and of Professor Rawls, neither of us was buying it. Both of us, from our different perspectives, thought you cannot prescind from questions of basic values, questions of morality, questions of what makes for or detracts from a valuable and morally worthy way of life. So we found ourselves sort of on the same side. Now, the motivation for the Rawlsian liberals of the day to adopt that position was a concern for freedom. They were worried that if the state took controversial positions on values issues, on moral questions, it would trample liberty. And here, Cornel and I shared the concern, although we didn't share the conclusion about how to deal with the concern. We too shared the belief in the importance of rights and liberties, and we share that today. And much of the work that we do around the country together is promoting rights and liberties, promoting civil liberties, especially in academia, promoting freedom of speech, arguing that we need to be absolutely vigilant to ensure people's right to speak, even if we think they're terribly wrong, even if we think their ideas are destructive and dangerous, even if we radically disagree and think that what they're advocating is unjust. We sound like liberals. Maybe we're the last true liberals, Cornel, I'm not sure, but we're standing up for those values, but not on the basis of Rawlsian so-called anti-perfectionism, prescinding from values questions, but on the basis of the values we share, especially the concern for truth and the concern for democracy. So although we were from different perspectives politically and ideologically, we shared the commitment to freedom and the idea that we have no easy way out in political theory. We're going to have to engage the great moral questions. Well, you can build a friendship on something like that. But the friendship really took off one day when a student of mine who was also a student of Cornell's showed up at my office and said, Professor George, some of us here in the student body are starting a new magazine, a magazine of arts and culture and politics and lifestyle. It's going to be called The Green Light. We've got the funding for it that we've raised. The Princeton students are very good at things like that, raising the money to do this project. And as part of the project, in every issue of the magazine, starting with the inaugural issue, we'd like to have a feature that has one professor at Princeton interviewing another professor. And I said, well, that sounds great. That sounds good. Is there a way I can help? And he said, yes, as a matter of fact, that's why I'm here. For the first issue, the inaugural issue, we've asked Professor Cornel West to be the interviewer. And he agreed to do that. When he asked, well, who would you like me to interview? We said, well, you choose. You can interview any other member of the faculty you like. And he said, Professor George, that he would like to interview you. So I said to him, his name was Andrew, I said, Andrew, now, is that right? So you asked the great Cornel West to be an interviewer and he could interview any member of the faculty that he wanted and he chose me? And Andrew said, yes. And I said, well, I want you to send a message back to Professor West. I want you to tell Professor West that Professor George said, but it is I who should be seeking baptism from you. I can tell that story here because the Catholics that are at the Aquinas Institute are going to know what that biblical reference is. Unfortunately, the student in question wasn't on top of that day. And so he answered by saying, huh? And I said, you just tell Professor West that. And he said, okay, I'll tell him that, but will you do it? And I said, yes, of course I'll do it. I'll be honored to do it. So the appointed day came and Cornel came along with Andrew and with a photographer. We were supposed to have a 1-hour interview and there was a tape recorder. We recorded an hour, but boy, once Cornel and I were into it, talking about every possible subject, talking about all the great thinkers of history, agreeing on some things, disagreeing on some things, really mixing it up, 4 hours went by. And then I noticed on my watch how late it was, 6 o'clock in the evening. And I said, Brother Cornel, this has just been a wonderful conversation. You know, we need to get to know each other better. We need to get acquainted. We need to get together more often and continue this conversation. He said, oh, Brother Robbie, we really need to do that. What a great idea. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. So I said, well, walk me to the car and we can continue the conversation on my way down to my car. It's parked down there on William Street by the Princeton University Press. So we walked down and we continued going at it. And then I got to the car and I had my hand on the door handle latch for another half hour while we continued because we couldn't let go of it. You got a couple of talkers, you got a couple of guys who were just interested in ideas. And of course, what he was saying was so interesting and so provocative and got me going and we just couldn't give it up. And finally I said, no, Brother Cornel, I'm gonna have to go home because my wife's going to submit a missing persons report to the police if I don't get up. Well, to complete the story, later that week, out of the blue, some of us members of the faculty, senior members of the faculty, got a note from the dean of the college saying, we need more senior faculty to teach in our freshman seminar program. please consider doing a freshman seminar. It can be on any topic you want. Well, the light bulb went off over my head, and I said, gosh, wouldn't it be wonderful if Cornel and I could just continue that conversation in the form of a freshman seminar with 16 or 18 of these brilliant young Princeton freshmen. And we'll do a book a week, no secondary sources. We'll choose 12 books for the 12-week semester, books that are important to us. I said, Cornel, if you could choose 6, I'll choose 6. Books that have been important in our own intellectual and spiritual odysseys, and then we'll build a seminar around it. Well, Cornel, thank God, said, yes, that's a great idea. Let's do it. We did it. And I'll tell you, from the very first minute of the very first seminar, it was magical. Very first minute of the very first seminar. I can remember what the text was for that seminar. Cornel, can you remember? It was Sophocles' Antigone.
Antigone.
We began with Antigone.
I remember that.
Our way all the way through. We did St. Augustine. We did Martin Luther, Babylonian Captivity of the Church. We did the 19th century John Henry Newman, John Stuart Mill. We did John Dewey in the 20th century, Martin Buber, Martin Luther King Jr., Letter from Birmingham Jail, Leo Strauss, Natural Right and History. And boy, once the magic started happening, well, we just said, we're just going to keep doing this. So we kept teaching together, and then pretty soon we were going around lecturing together, and then we were writing together, and we're praying together, and we're singing together. It's just been a beautiful, wonderful friendship, and one of the great blessings of my life.
I love it. What a wonderful story. Thank you, Professor George.
No, and what he says is so true. It's so true. Just spending time with Brother Robbie is an unadulterated delight and joy to revel in his humanity. The deep love that we have is not reducible to politics, even when he's wrong. Still love him, wrestle and so. But it's more than a friendship. We appreciate Aristotle's on friendship, but it's deeper than that. It is for its own sake and for the sake of the other in that deep sense. But it's a love in the Christian sense. And so our great pagan Aristotle didn't really get to the Christian virtue that Paul does of love, and it is a brotherhood in that sense. But I want to begin by saluting you, Brother Scott, and bless your precious family, your 3 precious loved ones, and want to acknowledge Brother Philip Di Stefano, who is bouncing back. We are praying for him. We are pulling for him. We just saw him. He looks very, very well and strong, and in process of feeling better. And very briefly, before I jump in, I do have precious memories of University of Colorado Boulder. I want to acknowledge, though. You know, it was a great Manny Marable who first brought me here almost 40 years ago, and he was running Black Studies. It was Margaret Ferguson, distinguished professor of English, who brought me here to open up the Humanities Center. That must have been about 35 years ago or so. I was here with my stepson at that time, Brother Adam Kotkin. Wonderful brother. He's flowering and flourishing now here in Boston, in the Boston area, but he graduated there at Boulder. And Eli Sachs, one of the most brilliant students to come through the Department of Religion at Princeton. Of course, he's Harvard undergrad as well. He's one of the kindest of persons you can ever meet. He's what, associate professor now in religious studies.
Religious studies and Jewish studies, yeah.
And he directs, I think now, the Jewish studies. His magnificent work, the dissertation on Moses Mendelssohn that he revised has now become a major contribution dealing with the father, modern Jewish thought and so forth. But I just want to acknowledge that, because I think one of the things that brings Brother Robbie and I together is that we begin with a note of piety, to stay in contact with the sources of good in our lives as we make our pilgrimage from womb to tomb. That Brother Robbie is who he is and who I am because somebody loved us. If you had a chance to meet Brother Robbie's mother and father and his family, you can see how easy it is to embrace them. They are gems of the spirit. He got a chance to meet my mother.
I did.
A gem of the spirit. So already it takes us outside of our egos. It takes us outside of our intimate connection to our political and ideological commitments. Those commitments are very important, but without the moral and spiritual dimensions of our formation that's rooted into something bigger than us. And even before you get to God, you're talking about the love that has gone into you. It's already a certain kind of gift, if not a secular analog to grace. And Robbie has a profound appreciation of that. Same would be true with Sister Cindy, his wife. If you got a chance to meet her, she is a gem. It's just who she is. You know, Robbie blessed every day to be with her, and vice versa. Don't get me wrong. So from the very beginning, you see, when you talk about civic discourse, you know, you're not beginning with, what is your view about X? Where do you stand on this issue? Right. How come you don't disagree on, how come you don't agree on? No. You got a precious human being on the other side of this conversation, wrestling with a whole host of things. And there's some difficult and delicate things. There's some things they're right about, there's some things they're wrong about, and you are precious. And you got something right and something wrong about you. And that's how Robbie and I have always encountered each other. That's why when we hear the question, is civic discourse dead? We look around and say, not in our hearts and minds and souls. Now, is it alive enough? No. Is it visible enough? No. And it's, in many ways, it's sad that we're trotted out as this ideological odd couple when we just brothers who love and respect one another and revel in each other's humanity and have joy in each other's presence, who he happens to be conservative Catholic brother tied to the great Thomas Aquinas and his rich legacy. And I happen to be this Holy Ghost Black Baptist coming out of Shiloh Baptist Church, who viewed as leftist, indeed leftist, but the leftism is always subordinate to something else, the moral and spiritual standards, you see. And so in that way, I think that, you know, in a moment in which our society is wrestling with such spiritual decay, the eclipse of the virtues like integrity, honesty, decency, courage, generosity, and more decrepitude, where people are so much obsessed with survival of the slickest, the careerism and the opportunism and the posing and the posturing and staying on the surface of life rather than having the courage to be what Melville called existential deep sea divers. That's what Samuel Beckett called the mess. And we know there's no Beckett without a Catholic named Pascal. Now, of course, as a Protestant and a Baptist, Pascal is probably the closest I get to the Catholic tradition with his Jansenism and with his opening to what would become a certain kind of much more Protestant formation, but Augustine too. I mean, of course, we have a larger discussion about that as well. But the answer to your question is that it's just a blessing to be able to reflect now, almost 20 years later.
That's right.
On what we have been able to create and sustain as two brothers, two Craig vessels, two brothers.
I love it. Well, thank you both. And I, as you're talking, I actually want to tweak the next question. So the next question, and again, this is just to get us into this conversation, but obviously the title, part of it was meant to be provocative originally, but then events unfolded in the last few months and it became a lot less provocative. But yeah. So the title we gave was, "Is Civil Discourse Dead?" And, you know, so the question is, you know, what do you think? Do you think it's dead or not? Is there still some breath in it? But I guess to add a nuance to the question, and I'm just thinking out loud as I'm listening to you, especially Professor West, I don't know, and I wonder if part of the problem, and I wonder what your observations are, I don't know. Yeah, it is, I think, sort of sad that you're seen as this odd couple and you're you know, carted out in a certain way, and maybe I'm guilty of doing that. But I hear what you're saying though. But
Yeah.
in another sense, I wonder if there's a giftedness that you guys have, because I wonder how many people actually have the gift that you have of one another. And are we becoming the kind of society that is so siloed that we really don't, Robert Georges don't have Cornel Wests, and Cornel Wests don't have Robert Georges? And is that part of why you have this perspective of, well, obviously there's a human being here, but without that, or with so many of our friends and people around us that maybe don't have those relationships, is civil discourse dying? And is that part of the reason? Thoughts?
Cornel?
Well, no, because I just love the way you formulated that, though, Brother Scott. That was very, very subtle and powerful, because it gives the question a certain freshness in terms of it being something dynamic. Is it dying? The dominant tendencies in the process itself becoming less and less potent. And I think that's a wonderful way of putting it, because then the question becomes, well, if we are so polarized, if we are so siloized, how do we even have conditions under which people with different ideologies, different politics, even encounter each other? And when they do encounter, what would motivate them to linger long enough? You know, for Robbie and I standing in front of the car for 45 minutes at the 4-hour dialogue, and others are saying, well, you know, I've had 2 minutes with you, and it's nice to have a little chat, but it's time for me to go. You know, you're not going to have a deep relationship.
Right.
You really aren't. And so, and I don't have a direct answer to your question, because I think when you live in a society in which more and more things are transactional, and more things are up for sale, or more and more people are up for sale, then you don't have the spiritual and moral wherewithal in place to have the kind of high quality relation that Brother and Robbie have, even before we get to the agreements or disagreements. And so let me pass that off to Robbie, but I just, is that a fair recharacterization of that question though, brother?
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
And again, I'm thinking through this out loud as well.
No, absolutely, because we're in conversation together, absolutely. But Brother Robbie, you want to jump right in?
Yeah, let me say a word about that, Cornel, just building on what you've said. I fear that the term civility has been debased when we talk about civil discourse, civil conversation. It's reduced sometimes in people's minds to politesse, being nice. But that's not civility, not in the sense that we would want people to embrace it, not in the sense that we would want to embrace it ourselves. Now, it's better to be polite than to be impolite. And if it's all we could get, that's
a low bar.
It's true. That's true.
We can get, and we need to strive for so much more than that. I can be polite by sitting back. Cornel and I could be in a room together having a conversation, and politeness would be, I sit quietly while he talks. He doesn't interrupt me. He doesn't strike me. And then it's his turn. And if he sat quietly while I talk, then I sit quietly while he talks. But that's not civility. And that's not a conversation. That's a couple of lectures. I listen to yours, you listen to mine.
Right, that's right.
We have to do more than hear the other guy and tolerate the other guy. We need to listen. And why would we listen? We need a motivation for it. What motivation could we have for genuinely listening? Not just hearing, not just sitting by politely. What motivation? The only motivation that will sustain it is the genuine belief that I could learn something from you. Now, this is easy for me because I learn from Cornel every time we have a conversation. I may not end up agreeing. I might end up agreeing. But I'm going to learn something whether I agree or disagree, because you got a truth seeker who's thought deeply about these things because he's concerned about getting to the truth. Now, a condition of my believing that I could learn something is intellectual humility. The only person who can believe he can learn something is somebody who doesn't already think he knows everything. The only person who can learn something is the person who realizes, I might be wrong. People who radically disagree with me. And when I say wrong, I don't mean just about trivial, superficial matters. I could be wrong about big, important things, matters of justice, human rights, morality, the common good. Now, since I know I could be wrong, I know I'm fallible, and I don't want to be wrong, the only chance I have of correcting myself and getting on the side of truth, if in fact I am wrong, is allowing myself to be challenged by the other guy, listening, not just hearing, not just sitting by politely, listening, hearing the guy who's your interlocutor with a view to trying to understand what truth there may be in what he is saying. Even if it's not completely true, there will still likely be some truth in it. So often when Cornel and I go around the country and we're talking to audiences, big audience, well, we got an audience here, it's just a virtual audience, we give a piece of advice. If you don't have a friend whom you regard as a genuine truth seeker and who thinks deeply because he's motivated for a desire for truth, by a desire for truth, if you don't have a friend like that who disagrees with you on great political and moral questions, you go find yourself one. That person's out there, he or she is out there, I guarantee it. Neither side has a monopoly on truth seekers. Neither side has a monopoly on thoughtful people, on learned people. I know profound truth seekers who are on the left and profound truth seekers who are on the right. All right? Now, if you don't know one yourself as a friend, you need to go out there. Now, as Cornel says, the way you build a relationship isn't starting with the question, what do you believe about the death penalty? What do you believe about affirmative action? What do you believe about abortion? Maybe the first question would be, where are you from? Tell us about the family. Tell me about the family you grew up in. You have brothers and sisters? How about mom and dad? Tell me about mom and dad. What sorts of things are important to you? What matters? You need to get to know each other. You need to build a relationship. But then you can't shy away from the deep questions. But once you've recognized each other as truth seekers and recognized your own fallibility, you won't want to shy away because you're not going to allow yourself to be offended by somebody disagreeing with you. You're not going to say, he's a communist because he disagrees with me. He's a Nazi because he disagrees. He's a racist because he disagrees with me. People are not going to say that. They're going to want to know, what's the argument? What are the reasons? What's the evidence that led you to where you are? And then when that conversation's going, people are going to learn. Again, they'll learn even if they don't change their views ultimately about it. They'll have a deeper understanding of it. John Stuart Mill, who somebody Cornel and I frequently teach when we teach together, John Stuart Mill laid all this out more than 150 years ago. He said, if you disagree with somebody about something, there are three possibilities. You're right and he's wrong. You're wrong and he's right. Or you're both part right, but part wrong. But no matter which it is, you should be willing to have the conversation, and you should certainly respect the freedom of the other person to articulate his view, no matter how radical it might be, no matter how unjust it might strike you as the thing he's advocating, because either way you have something to gain. If you're wrong, he might put you on the right path. If you're partly wrong and partly right, you might correct the part that's wrong. But even if you're entirely right and he's entirely wrong, if he's a deep thinker, a thoughtful person, a serious person, you'll emerge from the conversation with a deeper understanding. You might know that something is the case, but it's only on the basis of being challenged in a serious way by a critic that you can get to the deeper question of why it's the case, how it's the case, what's the deeper, larger, maybe even lasting significance of it being the case, the deep existential questions. So we've got if we just think about it, we've got every good reason in the world, every rational motivation in the world to respect people we disagree with, engage them genuinely, listen to them, try to learn from them, and respect their freedom. That's why I say Cornel and I, neither of us is a liberal, but we sound like liberals because we believe in respecting freedom of speech, even for speech we think is dangerous. we believe in respecting it for those million reasons. Both of us have been critics of Mill. But when it comes to that doctrine, as he sets it forth in his great work on liberty, second chapter, Cornel and I are right with him. And that puts us together with each other.
Yeah, you know, so you both wrote a statement back in 2017, I believe, called "Truth-Seeking Democracy and Freedom of Thought," and a lot of this is making me, because you're not talking about uniformity. We're not talking about, you know, disagreeing with each other, you know, going back and forth to the degree that everyone sort of believes the same. And as long as we can keep having these kind of back and forth, then we will have a uniformity to thought, and that will solve anything, which is not, of course, what you're getting at.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think part of it has to do with the fact that, you know, for Brother Robbie and myself, serious, substantive, intellectual inquiry, which is perennial, it's endless. So we're not relativists. There are certain interpretations that are better than others, but there's no interpretation that is pure, pristine, or perfect, as long as we're in space and time. But that intellectual inquiry goes hand in hand with a existential formation. So that, for example, I mean, one of the things that Brother Robbie and I talked about early on was, he said Plato changed his life. He came from Swarthmore. He came to Swarthmore, had his own, you know, liberal sensibilities, had his own philosophical shapings coming out of West Virginia. And West Virginia is a magnificent place, but it's not Paris or London, you know. So that he's going to be exposed to a whole lot of things he didn't have access to early on. And he encounters Plato, and this turning of the soul takes place. And I say, I want to know what was going on, Brother Robbie. You went from what to what? What was happening inside of you intellectually, but also your heart and soul? So you mean when Erasmus says Saint Socrates, pray for Socrates, pagan, gonna be a saint? Well, because he's a human being who looks at the world through his activity of intellectual conscience and integrity. But he's not part of the legacy of Jerusalem, no, because for those of us who come out of the legacy of Jerusalem, it's a Jesus or an Esther or an Amos, but for we Christians, it's a Jesus who weeps when Socrates never sheds a tear. And therefore, a saint is going to be someone who looks at the world through the lens of the heart in deep, loving connection with the other. That's not Socrates. That's something else. So we can learn both. Socratic legacies of Athens, prophetic legacy of Jerusalem, so rich, so deep, generating what Alfred North Whitehead calls a noble discontent, a critical discontent. You know, Herman Cohen said, give me Plato and the prophets. Well, that's another way of talking about Athens and Jerusalem. Okay, Herman. Okay, Brother Cohen. Plato and the prophets. You know, you would say, no, Aristotle too. Don't leave out it. Fine. Let's have a wonderful discussion. That's how we started in our intellectual conversation. Now, see, that conversation has been going on up until this very moment. I can look at it now and say, he already senses the tension between my Kierkegaardian sensibility, which is highly suspicious of any kind of excessive stress on reason, and his Thomistic sensibility says, no, reason will play a crucial role, but it won't be fetishized. It won't be deified. Faith will still play a role, but don't downplay reason, Brother Cornel. I said, okay, it's time to have some wine and cognac after the dialogue, because we need 4 hours to begin to work it through again. But it's that kind of encounter, interaction. It's intellectual, but it's also tied into the kind of human being he's become.
Yeah, this is exactly right. And Cornel here is recounting a conversation we've often had. I worry about this Kierkegaardian idea of a leap of faith. That's very attractive to Cornel, but I'm suspicious of it. You know, I'm suspicious that it reduces to an emotional sort of thing, and the emotions can lead us astray.
Right.
And Cornel's worried about, what might come across as my rationalism, my Aristotelian Thomism, too heavy a reliance on reason. And we have to remember, we as Christians, that reason was damaged by the fall too. It's not just that the will is weakened, it's the intellect is darkened. So we go back and forth. But look at the shared love of the Greeks between the two of us. Even a radical Reformation Christian, a Kierkegaardian like Cornel, still loves the Greeks. The little story of my life, my conversion story that Cornel was just telling you a little bit about, it wasn't a religious conversion. I was brought up as a Catholic, and I am a Catholic, and that hasn't changed. Although the experience I'm about to tell you about more fully deepened my faith. But here's what changed. I did not come from a highly educated background. Cornel mentioned I grew up in West Virginia. Both of my grandfathers were immigrant coal miners, worked in the mines and on the railroads. My father's father was a laborer his entire life. My mother's father was able eventually to save enough money, get himself out of the mines and open a little business, a small business. My father was saved from the mines really by World War II, took him out of high school, hadn't even graduated, off to Normandy in Brittany to fight. And then when he came back, it was a bit of a different world. He had more opportunities, didn't have to work in the coal mines, but still didn't get a college education, didn't get to go to college. So I was the first in my family to go to college. And my image of education was that it fundamentally was instrumental. Why did you want to go to education? Why did you want to learn things? Why did you want to gain knowledge? In order to get ahead, to rise up in the world, to get a better job, higher social standing. And those things aren't bad, and I still believe those are good things, and I want my own students to have those things as a result of their education. But it was only when I encountered Plato's dialogue Gorgias, this is what Cornel was telling you about, when all of a sudden it was like a bucket of cold water thrown in my face, and I woke up. And suddenly I saw, because Plato taught me, that ancient Greek grabbed me by the lapels, shook me and taught me that I was looking at knowledge and truth-seeking and education the wrong way. I was exclusively focused on its instrumental value and missing the more fundamental point, the intrinsic value of knowledge. Truth-seeking because of the inherent value of the truth. And it radically changed my life. It got me questioning everything. It shook me out of my political tribalism. Cornel mentions I was a liberal Democrat. Growing up in West Virginia, everybody in those days was a liberal Democrat. We were union people. We had a tribe we belonged to. And I had very conventional, coming out of the 60s, very conventional liberal advice. Well, all that had to now come under question because Plato, Socrates had awakened me. And so now I'm questioning everything, not focused on a desire to get ahead anymore, but for the intrinsic value of truth. And now I see this in the project. It put me on the vocational path I'm on. Cornel has a similar sort of background that puts him on the vocational path he's on. So what do we find ourselves in our classroom doing? Not just making sure our students are good exegetes, that they understand the text, that they're familiar with the competing interpretations by leading scholars of the text. All that's valuable. We do it. It's fine. But we want them wrestling with the text so that they will question their fundamental values. We teach brilliant students like your students out at University of Colorado, Cornell's at Harvard, mine at Princeton. They come in, they're brilliant kids. They're well-intentioned. They have good motivations. They want to be good people. But what's their attention focused on? Very often, and it's not bad, it's rising up, more money, influence, status, prestige, maybe some celebrity, and so forth. Those things aren't bad in themselves. And I want my students want to work for Goldman Sachs. I'm not going to say, don't do that, go work with Mother Teresa. Maybe I'd like for more of them to work for Mother Teresa. I want them to consider their vocation. Some have a vocation for business. Some have a vocation for the priesthood. Some have a vocation to work with the poor. Some have the vocation to be in justice movements. But I want all of them to question whether those values, those material values, are really what's ultimate. And of course, the answer is they're not. Those are secondary, derivative, instrumental values. They're not really what matter. They're not bad. You can do good things with wealth. Think of what philanthropy has done. The Benson Center is a product of philanthropy. Princeton University, Harvard University, largely a result of philanthropy. We're not state sponsored. Philanthropy can do many great things, help the poor. Same with influence. If you have influence, you can do good things with your influence. Unfortunately, you can also do bad things, but you can do good things. So we're not saying to our students, don't seek wealth, don't seek influence, but we're reminding them, we're trying to get them to see that those things are not what ultimately matters. They're not what really matters. What really matters is family, faith, friendship, honor, integrity, reaching out for others, putting others first, living a life of service. It can be in business. It can be working with Mother Teresa on the streets of Calcutta, but serve somebody. We're here to serve. Now, that's a Christian understanding, but it's not just a Christian understanding. We find that in the Jewish tradition. We find that in the Islamic faith. We find that in the great traditions of the East. Cornel and I are Christians. We're strong Christians. We believe our religion. But we respect and we find similar values understandings in all the great traditions. And this is what we want to open our students up to. So here again, you see a deep sharing.
Well, that's perhaps a perfect segue into, and you've talked about it a little bit, but I'd love to sort of zero in a little bit. So again, we've said the Aquinas Institute is, of course, a Christian organization, and you both clearly are identified as followers of Jesus. But to get a little more specific, Professor George, I've heard you describe yourself as a conservative Catholic, and Professor West as a revolutionary Christian, not a liberal Christian again, but a revolutionary Christian. And I would love for you to talk about what those identifiers mean to you and how they shape how you approach the question of the night, of the possibility of civil discourse or the demise of civil discourse. How do those identities actually shape that question for you?
Cornel, I've been yakking away too much. You go.
No, you haven't been yakking, brother. You've been laying down some wisdom. Brother Scott has such good queries, though. It's nice just to kind of come up with an excuse to get a chance of thinking as a response to it. No, I'm just kidding. But, for me, to be a follower of Jesus is to try to hold on to the most radical anti-idolatrous impulse possible for a creature in space and time. It is to put every particular worldly symbol under the cross. So as much as I can appreciate any flag of a nation, that flag is under the cross. As much as I can subscribe to any ideological framework or philosophical school of thought, it's still under the cross. So any form of idolatry. And people always wonder, why did Jesus make his way to the temple and run out the money changers when that temple was the largest edifice east of Rome, with the troops on the one side and the bankers there and all of the chattering classes engaged in their chit chat and banter and conversation as the poor were left out with very little assets. Jesus, this righteous indignation, this loving, sweet Jesus running out these money changers. What's going on? I see idolatry. Will you follow me? Well, I'm on Pontius Pilate's payroll. That's all right. I can change you. I can turn you around. I got a tax collector hanging out with me. So and I got a zealot hanging out with me. Who is this Jesus that I'm following? Well, the anti-idolatrous impulse begins with oneself. Well, I've got a identity, a gender identity, a racial identity, a national identity. That's what I'm going to elevate. No, that identity is under the cross. It's got to be grounded in something bigger than your skin pigmentation, grounded in something bigger than your sexual orientation, what have you. Now, all these are ways of being in the world. They're not to be trashed. Each human being made in the image of God. But when it comes to nation, gender, color, race, what have you, if one is elevating them over the cross from my own revolutionary Christian point of view, idolatry. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Somewhere I read, you know what I mean? Somewhere I read, What does that mean? Well, how do you, even justice itself? We talk about this all the time with Reinhold Niebuhr. Any justice that's only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice. Justice itself can become idolatrous. So yes, we have a tremendous critique of white supremacy, tremendous critique of patriarchy, tremendous critique of homophobia if it loses sight of the humanity of those made in the image and likeness of God. Absolutely. But the revolution that we're talking about is a revolution in which we look at the world through the lens of the cross, and therefore the world is turned upside down. The values that Brother Robbie was talking about of the world are not going to be the values that one kowtows to or has an uncritical deference to. They have a role and a function, but they're not going to be the standard. And what that means in the end is, you're in the world, but not of it. Because much of the world, like most of human history, is that of domination, hatred, subjugation, resentment, envy. And you're trying to hold on to that love in such a world, such a grim world, such a bleak world, you see. And yet there's always enough of that love that keeps you going. Now, why is there enough? It's one of the mysteries of the world. Why is it in such a ugly, vicious history of the species that there's still enough love for Robbie's mother to look in the sparkle of his eye in West Virginia and say, you have a value that's not reducible to the categories of the world. And your name is Robbie. Oh, appreciate that, Mama. Ah, that's just one manifestation of some power that is so much greater than what confronts one in such a dark and grim world. And by dark and grim, I'm not just talking about the last 4 years. I'm not just talking about the last 10 years. I'm talking about the history of the human race, with all of the suffering, all of the tears, all of the hatreds, all of the despair, and yet somehow the power of that love is still manifest.
Scott, I've been sitting here listening to that beautiful summary of the Christian faith and trying to think of something to disagree with, trying to find something to disagree with in there. And I think the only thing I can find to disagree with is the label. Cornel calls that revolutionary Christianity. I just call that Christianity. In the Christian vision, it's all under the cross. Everything is subordinated to God in Christ. Nationality, it's important. I think we should be patriotic. God first.
That's right.
Loyalty to community, yeah, but God first. Even loyalty to family. If family wants you to do something contrary to the will of God, God first. Now, we could say, Cornel, yeah, that's because Christianity is revolutionary.
Oh, inherently revolutionary.
And that's
a good point.
Against the powers of the world, Christianity is a revolution. It was a revolution in the ancient world. It overturned the greatest empire. It did. And it was largely poor people, slaves. It was not the religion of the wealthy and the rich. Now, eventually it became that, but not in the beginning. There were 12 fishermen and, tax collectors. It was not the beautiful people and the celebrities. And then when it opened to the Gentile church, even there, again, as I say, slaves, poor people, and so forth. So there's a sense in which it's a revolutionary doctrine. It's a revolution against all power. And of course, it's a danger to any autocracy, any kind. This is why the tyrants of the left and the tyrants of the right have always feared Christianity. Hitler feared it. Stalin feared it. Every tyrant fears it because it relativizes allegiance to any human thing. Now, why do I call myself a conservative Catholic? Sometimes call myself a Vatican II Catholic because I buy the whole thing. It seems right to me the teaching on religious liberty and Dignitatis Humanae, which is sometimes regarded as the liberal doctrine, the liberal document of the Second Vatican Council, I think it's right on the mark. It's exactly right. The church here acknowledges and understands the importance of faith as the free act of the intellect and the will, understanding that faith is not something that can be coerced. It is no longer faith if it's the product of coercion. All coercion can reach are the outward expressions of faith if it's there. It can force you to go to church. It can force you to attend the Passover Seder. It can force you to pray 5 times in the mosque. But it can't actually reach the internal acts of intellect and will that are the substance of actual faith. I say I'm a conservative Catholic because I stand with the teachings of the church, which I think in the moral domain are also teachings of natural law, which are accessible, as a good Aristotelian Thomist would believe, even to unaided reason. Now, I think that the data of revelation can profoundly illuminate what reason can understand on its own, unaided. But reason can understand the fundamentals of morality on its own. This is, I think, what St. Paul has in mind in the letter to the Romans, early on in the letter, when he says that there is a law written on the hearts, even of the Gentiles who don't have the law of Moses. And St. Paul makes clear that this is a law that is sufficient for accountability and even for judgment. You're held accountable. It's no excuse to say, well, I didn't have the Christian faith. I didn't have the Christian revelation. Even the Gentiles who do not have the law of Moses are accountable because they know. This is why Dr. King, in that great document that Cornel and I teach so often, the letter from Birmingham jail, says that how do you distinguish a just from an unjust law? An unjust law is a law that is out of harmony with the natural law and the law of God. He notes both. The law of God, we know through authority, the teaching of the church, of the scripture. The natural law we know by natural reason, unaided reason. So very often I find that Catholics and other Christians today sometimes feel that, you know, the traditional moral teachings of the church in particular need to give way to modern understandings or progressive thinking. And there I'm with the church. So if that makes me a conservative Catholic, then I'm a conservative Catholic. I'll embrace the label. I think where the church is teaching one thing and the New York Times is teaching something else, I suspect most of the time the church is right and the New York Times is wrong. But guess what? Most of my academic colleagues disagree with me about that. Their magisterium is the New York Times, not the Catholic Church. So if they're progressives or liberals or whatever they want to call them, that makes me a conservative, and that's fine. I can live with that.
And we got to remember, it was the New York Times that said Martin Luther King Jr. was the echo of the communists in Hanoi when he came out with a moral and spiritual critique of the Vietnam War, because Vietnamese babies have the same value as white babies in Connecticut, Black babies in Mississippi, brown babies in Los Angeles, indigenous babies in Idaho. All of a sudden, he becomes a communist. New York Times, please, all the news fit, we shall see.
Yeah.
Socratic sensibility, badly needed. But, you know, I think in this context, it was very important to lift up the great Gilbert Keith Chesterton.
G.K. Chesterton.
And to highly, highly recommend people to read his classics on orthodoxy and St. Francis of Assisi. I mean, it's so many of them, but just those two. Yeah. Why? Because, I mean, here's somebody who is able to bring together this magnificent revolution in the species having to do with Hebrew scripture. And here we're talking about the radical Jewishness of Jesus. And that hesed, that loving kindness and steadfast love that ought to be shared with orphan and widow, with fatherless and motherless, the weak and the vulnerable. Do justly, love mercifully, walk humbly with thy God. But then he also brings in the legacy of Athens that has to do with, yes, a love of learning and a love of language and a love of law that we get with our precious Jewish brothers and sisters, and a love of stranger that we get with Jesus. Leviticus 19, love thy neighbor as thyself, what we Christians identify with. But the Greeks also have a deep sense of the comic with Aristophanes. Yeah. Antigone, they've got a deep sense of the tragic that is not tied to a notion of divine providence and so forth, you see. So that tension, especially in the history of the West. Now, of course, we can go to the rich traditions and civilizations of Africa. Maulana Karenga and others has taught us much about Africa and Egypt, and concerns about image of God, concerns about justice for the poor. So it's not as if Athens and Jerusalem have a monopoly on all the wisdom in the history of the world. No, my God, you got Confucius, you got Buddha, you got even traditional religions and so on. So you're open the way Brother Robbie was saying, but in the end, one has to make one's own choice. And even when you make a secular choice, there's a very good chance that you are a rich footnote for one of the great antecedent figures of Athens or Jerusalem in the West. Because of Nietzsche, in all of his greatness and genius and being wrong, if he, in his creativity, acknowledges he's got to pull from the Greeks, he's got to pull from Jerusalem, he's connected with the tragic writers, he's connected to his version of Christianity. Martin Luther, being in Germany, he's a Lutheran, like so many of the great 19th century German philosophers who were secular folk who broke from their particular Lutheranism. If that's the case, then you have to be very honest and candid about what was in place before you made your break. And so you can become almost a kind of parasite on a host. You think you're making a radical break. I'm secular, I'm autonomous. Really? Have you read Lucretius? You think you're a thoroughgoing materialist? Take a look on the nature of things. You think you understand desire and pleasure? Spend a little time with Epicurus. We can go on and on and on. That's part of the rich conversation, but that has to be viewed as something that doesn't have some kind of ideological ownership. A lot of times, Brother Robbie and I will talk this way, and people say, oh, you must be talking about the conservatives on campus. I say, my conservative brothers and sisters have no monopoly on the legacies of Athens and Jerusalem. What are you talking about? Now, if it is the case that my conservative brothers and sisters tend to talk about it more, then we really need to check things out. We need to spend a little more time in conversation with them. Oh, you all think you got a monopoly on Diderot? Oh, no, Diderot's coming at you all tooth and nail. But he is as rooted in those traditions as is Chateaubriand, conservative brother, genius of Christianity, worth reading, worth wrestling with, very different political space than Diderot. So in that sense, it broadens the conversation. That's one of the things that Brother Robbie we have fun about in this regard, you know what I mean? So it's interesting about how it is that so many of these so-called conservative institutes or conservative spaces in the university have to deal with these cantankerous, iconoclastic, idiosyncratic folk. Dante's got a bounty on his head. They're trying to kill him. And he becomes the greatest of all Christian poets. That doesn't really sit too well with folk who are, somehow lining up behind so-called narrow conservative sensibilities in the 21st century. Dante, he can't be reduced to that.
Another area in which discourse is important across lines of division, we've mainly been talking about politics, but is religion. I think one of the great things, there's much that's gone wrong from my perspective, my conservative perspective, we've gone down some bad paths in my lifetime. But here's something that's gone right and is going in the right direction. In my lifetime, we have witnessed a blossoming of interfaith dialogue and understanding and cooperation that is serious. It's not mere politesse. The dialogue now between Protestants and Catholics, especially evangelical Protestants and Catholics, is very rich. Richard John Newhouse, Timothy George, the Catholic evangelicals and Catholics together, such a productive conversation. And the magnificent conversation going on now between Christians and Jews. Some of my greatest dialogues have been with the late, I'm so sad to say the late, because he died so recently and I miss him so much, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, from whom I learned so very much from his writings as well as in these conversations. The conversations between those of us in the Western monotheistic traditions and those in the East. Cornel's been involved in some of these with Hindu thinkers and with Buddhist thinkers. And a very important moment, I mentioned the Second Vatican Council, and I mentioned the document Dignitatis Humanae on religious liberty, but I hope that everybody at the Aquinas Institute at the university there also familiarizes himself or herself with the great document Nostra Aetate of the Second Vatican Council, which is the document that affirms robustly all that is true and holy in the great religions of the world, even the non-Christian religions of the world. Opening up the dialogue from which we can learn. We shouldn't think, we Catholics, that we know everything. We don't know everything. We shouldn't think we don't have things to learn from other traditions of faith. We do have things to learn from other traditions of faith. That doesn't mean we're giving up our faith or abandoning our faith or embracing religious relativism or indifferentism or claiming that all religions are equally true or false, or that truth or falsity in religion doesn't matter. But we're recognizing that there are things that are true and holy and good and righteous in the other faiths, and we need to learn and we need to cooperate. That's another beautiful thing. The wonderful interfaith cooperation, Christians and Muslims, Christians and Jews, across these traditions. So much of human history has been warfare and violence between people and oppression of different faiths based on faith. I'm glad to be rid of that. That's something I don't want to conserve. I like the new dispensation, where we're working together, when I can have a brotherhood with my Protestant brother Cornel, when I can have a brotherhood with my Jewish brother Jonathan Sacks, or my Muslim brother Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. That's something that's going in the right direction. There we're getting out of our religious silos. But politically, no. Now we're going in the wrong direction. You mentioned silos earlier. This is a bad situation. If conservatives are doing nothing but listening to Fox News and reading the National Review and the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and progressives are watching MSNBC and reading the New York Times and reading the Nation magazine, all that's going to happen there is something that Cornel and I abominate. That is, everybody being reinforced in what they already believe, nobody being challenged, nobody being unsettled. And they're being taught that people who disagree with them are one of two things. Either they are bad people or ignorant people. Either they are frauds or they are fools. Either they are bigots or they are stupid, or both. And that is just a recipe for cultural disaster. It's exacerbating this terrible polarization and the demonization that we are seeing. We've got to get out of these silos. In part, it's the product of technology that enables us to hide in our own spaces and only hear people, even online. You know, where your Facebook friends are all people who agree with you. Your Twitter followers are all people who agree with you. And we're just simply being reinforced. You know what we're being reinforced in when we allow that to happen? Prejudices. Some of them might be right, some of them might be wrong, but they're not actual thoughts. They're just prejudices. We happen to believe them. If we're lucky, they happen to be right. We haven't thought our way to them because we haven't engaged the reasons they might be wrong. You know, you're really only entitled to count a view as a true opinion if you reason your way to it, if you think about it, if you consider what's to be said against it as well as what's to be said in favor of it. Otherwise, it's something that happens to you. It's like an experience. It's not something you actually do, an activity, knowing.
Absolutely. I mean, the three of us actually in our own calling as teachers are fundamentally wedded to the Negro national anthem, the Black national anthem. Lift every voice, not lift every echo. You see, echo just an extension of an echo chamber. It's a copy. It's an imitation. It's an emulation. We all begin with imitation and emulation. But in the end, like our fingerprint, we want each student, each human being to have a unique voice, to think for themselves, love for themselves, laugh for themselves. Don't laugh for somebody else. Don't love for somebody else. And you can't think for somebody else, you see. But the only way you find your voice, and this is, of course, the language of the jazz world and the blues world. You can't be a jazz man or a blues woman unless you find your voice. Quit imitating. Aretha, quit imitating Marion Williams. John Coltrane, quit imitating Johnny Hodges. Russell Tompkins Jr. of the stylistic. Quit imitating Eddie Holman, who's singing Lonely Girl. I won't sing it for you, even though I know my brother pull out his banjo and we'll do a thing for you. But the important thing is, Robert Zimmerman, you can't imitate Robert Johnson. You a Jewish brother from Minnesota. Rename yourself Bob Dylan, that's fine. But no, you got your own voice, Dylan. You just know your voice is one that is in conversation with a genius from Delta, Mississippi named Robert Johnson, or a genius from the vanilla side of town named Hank Williams. Both of them blues, deeply American, deeply Southern, but they found their voices. And so that becomes the crucial thing in terms of breaking from the narrow tribalism, chauvinism, and so forth and so on. And it's an endless process. Brother Robbie and I, we bounce our voices up against each other. We try to deepen it, sharpen it in that way. And same would be true, Brother Scott, we had more time to spend with you though, man.
Something we need, and something, again, that we need to impart to our young people, and I hope the young people who are listening will take this to heart. We mustn't do away with piety. We need piety. And here I'm not just talking about religion. There's religious piety too, and that's important. When Cornel and I talk about piety, we're talking about a more general reality. That is understanding your debt, gratefully understanding your debt to those who made your advantages possible. It's piety when Bob Dylan acknowledges that he didn't start from scratch. He's got his own voice, he's doing his distinctive thing, but he owes piety. And the great thing about Dylan is he knows he owes piety to Robert Johnson. I'm a banjo player, as Cornel just mentioned. When the great banjo player Bela Fleck was in Princeton 2 years ago, I heard him. It was a wonderful performance with his wife, who's also a great banjoist, at McCarter Theater. There was a poignant moment as he was putting on his finger picks that you use in the style of playing that he does. And he said simply, "I am a disciple of Earl Scruggs." Now, Earl Scruggs was a banjo player from the western part of North Carolina who invented the bluegrass style of banjo playing, the three-finger style of banjo playing. But Scruggs's playing, compared to Fleck's playing, is very, very simple and straightforward. Fleck has brought in jazz influences and African musical influences and influences from India. And he plays much more complicated and difficult things. And yet he takes a moment in his performance in piety to recognize he wouldn't be doing any of that.
Absolutely.
Not for the breakthrough of Earl Scruggs. He could play circles around Earl Scruggs today, if Scruggs were still alive. That's not where he's focused, on how great he is. He's focused on the fact that he'd be nowhere had Scruggs not done what he did. And what's true of music is true generally. There's Santana. There you go.
See, this is the great modern philosopher of piety.
That's it.
John Dewey Bills, and of course our dear brother Jeff Stout. Here's another brother. These are for the students. Here's my teacher, Hans-Georg. Centrality of different traditions shaping us in such a way that we acknowledge and pay dues to what came before, not uncritically. Robbie's not talking about an uncritical thing. Same is true with our dear sister,
Toni Morrison.
Toni Morrison says, I exist because of, yes, the deep Black tradition, yes, the rich African civilizations, but also Faulkner.
Yeah.
Also Virginia Woolf. also on and on, that acknowledgement in that way. And that's one reason why even Robbie and I begin our conversation oftentimes talking about our families and parents and teachers and coaches and so forth. Where would we be without those folks?
There's a danger today. And again, to young people, I want to say it's a danger. Stay away from it. The idea that we're going to start the world anew from scratch. This was the great error of the French revolutionaries. Oh, all of history is corrupt. All of history is bad. We don't know any piety. We're going to build from scratch. Everything before was injustice and oppression. There was a lot of injustice and oppression. We can all acknowledge that, need to acknowledge that. But we can't build from scratch, or we will build tyranny and repression on a scale we've never seen before. The French revolutionaries did that. The Bolsheviks did that. The Nazis did that. So we can't be canceling the great thinkers of our tradition. Don't cancel Abraham Lincoln. Don't cancel the authors of the Federalist Paper. You may disagree. I disagree with Hobbes, violently disagree with Hobbes. I don't want to cancel Thomas Hobbes. I want to read him. I want to learn from him. I want to engage him. And I want my students to do that. Aristotle, Plato. Aristotle defended natural slavery. Do you think I agree with that? Of course I don't agree with that. Am I going to cancel Aristotle? I would be an idiot. And I'd be, if we did this as a society, we'd be putting ourselves on the road to tyranny. So we need to understand our debt. If we think what we're thinking today is good and just and we're going in the right direction, we didn't get there on our own by ourselves. There's a deeper tradition. There are great figures and great thinkers, some of whom were wrong on some big things, some of whom did bad things in their lives. But we've got to understand. This is why in the statement that Cornel and I put out recently together in the Boston Globe called Honesty and Courage, where we said that these are the crucial virtues that we have to recover. We began, the earliest points in our paper are that we have to honor our heroes while at the same time acknowledging their faults. Martin Luther King. Cornel and I are great admirers of Martin Luther King. We invoke him all the time. I've already invoked him in this conversation, his letter from Birmingham jail, which we teach. But he did some bad things. His attitude toward women, his treatment of women, we now know, not good, in some ways reprehensible. And yet we recognize his heroism, his courage, our debt to him. Where would we be had it not been for his witness? He gave us the nonviolent response to racial injustice. The violent response would have led to a different place and probably not to the abolition of racial injustice either. So we need to acknowledge our debt to these great heroes, even as we also recognize they had flaws and faults, sins.
Absolutely.
Am I right, Cornel?
Absolutely, my brother. And that also begins with ourselves.
Absolutely.
What are they going to say about us 50, 100 years from now, if the planet is still here, if human greed hasn't run so thoroughly amok that they blow the whole thing up or the ecological catastrophe takes over? What will they say about us? How will we callous? How will we too indifferent to the suffering?
Let me stop you there, because that's so, we have only a short amount of time left.
Well, we can go after, we go by the Spirit. We go by the Spirit.
I love it. That's what, so I dropped.
Yeah, absolutely. Aquinas go by the Spirit. Remember, what did he do? He said he wanted to burn all the summa and live was like straw after he had that
like straw
experience. Isn't that true?
So I treated a lot of my questions as straw and threw them out because I loved this. I loved this back and forth. But I want to see if I can squeeze in two more quick things. One is kind of a conflation of some questions that came in. And then I want to end with something specific that goes back to what you just said. But one question that I've gotten a number of questions that are the same kind of theme. And so I'm going to rephrase a bunch of questions into one. But, in a certain sense, so again, you both are sort of held up as the ideological odd couple or whatever you're sometimes called. But in truth, I mean, even through the course of this conversation, you share a profound foundation. I mean, your Christian roots. I mean, even hearing you talk, there's so much commonality. And so what some of our students really want to know is, what if you simply cannot find any point of common ground, any point of commonality in moral, whatever it is? What do you do if you seem to have reached an impasse where there is no foundation to begin from? Then what?
If you look at the statement that you kindly referenced earlier that Cornel and I put out in 2017, and I hope everyone will, the statement was called Truth-Seeking Democracy and Freedom of Thought and Expression.
Right, and I'm going to put a link to it on our website so people can check it out.
Oh,
You'll see
wonderful.
really the answer to your question. Cornel and I stand firmly for the proposition that all of us needs to be prepared to engage in a serious, reflective way, an open-minded way, willing to consider that we might be wrong, with anyone, no matter how radical, how harmful we think their views are. We're prepared to engage anyone who is prepared to do business in the proper currency of intellectual discourse, a currency consisting of reasons, arguments, and evidence. My colleague Peter Singer at Princeton supports the morality of infanticide. Needless to say, with my pro-life convictions, going beyond abortion all the way to infanticide, the killing of newborn babies, perfectly healthy newborn babies, which Peter thinks is morally permissible. You can imagine what I think of that. And yet, I came to his defense publicly and in writing in the Philadelphia Inquirer when his critics wanted to shut him down and get his tenure revoked at Princeton because of what they regarded as his unacceptable, unjust, extreme views. The disability rights people came to Princeton. They chained themselves to the gates of the university, demanding that President Eisgruber, our president, revoke Singer's tenure and fire him. Now, why would I, a pro-life conservative, dedicated to the principle that every human being is made in the image and likeness of God, beginning with the child in the womb, the newborn child, the cognitively disabled child with Down syndrome, all the way to the frail elderly person suffering from dementia. Why would I rush to the defense of Peter Singer? Because I agree with him? No, I disagree with him. But because he is willing to do business in the currency of proper intellectual discourse. He gives reasons. He challenges me. He makes me think. He gives arguments. He cites evidence. If he's wrong, I should be able to figure out why he's wrong. If I can't figure out why he's wrong, I need to consider maybe he might be right. And I'll tell you something, in having to engage with Peter, which I've done mostly in print, although occasionally also in person, having to engage, he's deepened my understanding of these issues. Hasn't changed my mind. I haven't changed his mind. But boy, I've got a better, deeper understanding and appreciation of the pro-life position and what its demands on us are and the grounds of that position than I would have if I didn't engage him. So Peter and I, he's a secularist, he's an atheist, he's a utilitarian. He's much farther from me or from Cornel than Cornel and I are from each other. He's really far. And yet I wouldn't shut him down. And in fact, not only would I not shut him down, I'll sit down with him and have a conversation. I want to, because he'll challenge me. He'll deepen my understanding. If I'm wrong, he'll show me that I'm wrong. He's a truth seeker in the same way that I try to be a truth seeker. I know this is radical. I know some people really outraged when I say this, but it's true. As far as I can tell, he misses the truth on these big issues, but I know that's what he's after, just in the same way that I'm after. He's not a demagogue. He's not a hater. He's not someone who manipulates people rhetorically. He doesn't try to shut other people down. He joins Cornel and me on the question of free speech. He signed that statement. Truth-seeking democracy. If you look at I think there are about 5,000 signers. One of the first 10 is Peter Singer, one of the first names on the list. We can have that fellowship, even with someone we radically disagree with. Now, if someone's not a truth seeker, if they're a demagogue, they're just shouting at you, they're calling you names, well, you're wasting your breath on them.
Right.
What can you do? But don't read someone out of the human race. Don't refuse to engage with them because they've got what strikes you as a radical view or one that could be damaging. Cornel and I engage with Marxists all the time. What philosophy in all of human history has piled up more corpses than communism? You show me. You won't find one. Communism has the largest pile of corpses. And yet, I'm perfectly willing, happy to engage with Marxists. There are serious Marxists who have things to say. There are things we can learn. The great Eugene Genovese did some of his best work before he returned to the Catholic faith in his Marxist stage. Cornel, he wrote Roll, Jordan, Roll, that great work on American slavery in his Marxist phase. we can learn from that despite the vast chasm between me as a conservative Christian and Eugene Genovese in his Marxist stage as an atheist materialist.
Absolutely. You know, Brother Scott, I got in a little more controversy a couple of days ago when I said on television that Donald Trump was my brother and he needs to try Jesus because Jesus specializes in turning gangsters inside out so they can go another way. And I've been saying that for 5 years. I do think he's a neo-fascist gangster, but I know I've got gangster elements in me. And that, you see, as a follower of Jesus, we are told to love everybody. We're told to love our enemies. Probably the greatest Christian theologian, and certainly the greatest Protestant theologian of the 20th century was Karl Barth. And I know there's Lonergan and David Tracy and others on the Catholic side who were towering figures. But he had a notion of radical love and radical freedom and love. It's not only that you can find something to love in somebody else, but they're made in the image of the same God that you are, and therefore they have the capacity to make a choice that allows them to be different than they are at the moment, so that no deed fully exhausts one's humanity. I've taught in prisons for 41 years. I've taught murderers and rapists and gangsters and thugs. Nobody would have thought that they could go another way. And yet some do, some don't, but some do, you see. So we're not talking about any kind of sadomasochistic liking gangsters. We're not rationalizing their ugliness and barbarity and so forth, but it's just simply saying that they are still on a human continuum with us. And there are moments in which in our own lives, we do certain things, we still want to be loved. That's what we love about our mamas oftentimes. How do we get this unconditional love? Oh, do you really know who you loving if I really disclosed all my secrets? Don't you worry, child. I'm going to love you anyway. Even Faulkner could see that in Adelphi in Sound of Fury, right? Or he could see that in a Carol Barr, who was the mammy who he dedicated Go Down Moses to, who raised him from a little boy, who he had the funeral in his own living room in Oxford, Mississippi. And they say, what? Faulkner, Vanilla Brother, Jim Crow, Mississippi, apartheid South in America. That's right. She loved me in a way I could never understand. And I love her in a way you'll never understand, even though slavery is a structure and institution and therefore needs to be radically called into question. So when people say, well, there's just certain people I meet, I just reach a point we have absolutely nothing in common. Like Brother Robbie said, did you ask the question about their mama? Do you think they have some liking of their mama? They probably do. Do you have a liking of your mama? Oh, so you got something in common. Why'd you close down so quick? Why'd you foreclose the movement so fast? You didn't linger long enough. Did you ask them about their sports team? Oh, they love the Lakers. So do you. Oh, I'll be dang. I tell the story of Robbie all the time when I was in Charlottesville with some of the real sick white brothers. Neo-Nazis, Ku Klux Klan, spitting on us, cussing us out. And we walk through the park and they listening to Motown black music. Now that's America, right? So that you meet a Nazi brother and say, man, you're trying to kill me, but you love the music that many black folk produced. Isn't that something? We got actually more in common. Now, at the moment, you're trying to kill me, so we got something else to talk about. Not like we're going to spend the whole discourse on Stevie Wonder at the moment, but they playing Stevie. So that's just one example among a whole host of others. You see what I mean? So you have to be patient. Somewhere I read, love is patient. That's what Paul's talking about, that 13th chapter in the 1 Corinthians, which means it's not always on your terms. It's not always on your timetable. You got to open yourself up. Give it a chance to make the connection in that way, you see. And so I find it difficult when people say, I just can't find anything whatsoever to find anything in common. You got a common language. You're both dreaming in the language of Shakespeare and John Milton and Toni Morrison. you're communicating about the fact that you can't communicate in the same language. Interesting. Interesting. It'd be different if you were still working through on your Aramaic and English. Then you're gonna have a real challenge. A little sign language, touch, grin. I mean, I'm going on and on. I'm sorry to go on, but you see the point I'm making. I'm suspicious of some of these excuses of my fellow citizens and fellow human beings saying, well, you know, we had a 6-minute encounter. It was clear I had absolutely nothing in common with them whatsoever. And then they went home and watched the same television show. Oh, sure, you have nothing in common. Did you watch the Super Bowl? Oh, yes, I wouldn't miss that he did too.
Scott, I know we're just about out of time. Maybe we're past time, but I can't help just calling everyone's attention to what you just heard. I mean, this is another reason I love Cornel, just the sheer integrity. He gets into trouble all the time, not with the conservatives. A lot of us just love him. He gets in trouble with his fellow progressives. Why? Because he's willing to tell the truth as he sees it, even if it upsets them. He'll call Donald Trump Brother Trump. He'll go on TV and say, no, wait a minute, you can't condemn all Trump supporters. You can't say all Trump supporters are fascist. You can't say all Trump supporters are racist. You can't say that. Well, he gets in trouble with the progressive side. He criticizes Trump's mendacity, but he criticized Obama's mendacity. No one was harder on Obama for lying, for misbehavior than Cornel West. I was pretty tough on Obama. I've been pretty tough on Trump, but I wasn't as tough on Obama as Cornel was. So that's integrity. And that's what we really need more of. And I think the way we'll get more of it is for people like Cornel to do what he does, which is to exemplify it. We need role models. We need examples, people who are out there not being driven by tribalism, willing to say things that get them in trouble with their own camp. Why? Because they think they're true, because they think their own camp has gone off the reservation, gone wrong in saying something like all of the Democrats are communists, or all of the Republicans are fascists, or things like that. We need integrity like that. And the way we're going to get it is for people to start just exemplifying that virtue in their own lives.
And that's where the love is still central, though, Brother Scott, that when I go into a Black church, I tell them quite explicitly that I'm not here for popularity. I'm here to bear witness to a spiritual integrity. So I don't want to say something so you like me. I love you because you're worthy of being loved, not because of your skin pigmentation or your identity, because you made in the image of a great God. And the same would be true. White brothers and sisters, they're loved because they're worthy of being loved, even when they're spiritually sick or morally decrepit, locked into white supremacists, or whatever kinds of ways of losing sight of humanity, you see. So it's a certain understanding of how you intend to live your life through space and time, following a Palestinian Jew named Jesus that sets the standard, that's deeper, greater, grander, sweeter, more gentle and tender than each and every one of us.
And it seems to me, I mean, what a great note to sort of wrap us up on, but it seems to me at the same time that integrity that you're talking about, which is not an easy thing, that integrity requires exactly what you said, Professor West, that the assurance and the confidence of being loved. And if you don't have the confidence or the assurance that you are loved, it's really hard to have the kind of integrity that can get you into trouble and become unliked if you are not rooted in that reality. And so maybe we really do have a problem of belovedness and love in our society because we don't feel like we can have integrity in these ways. So what a wonderful insight that is.
You know, we Christians, of course, learn from St. Paul that there are three great theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. And St. Paul says the greatest of these is love. But even in saying that the greatest of these is love, he doesn't vitiate the other two. In fact, they are integrally connected to each other.
That's right. That's right.
The other. And here, let me lay some emphasis, as Cornel and I often do, on the virtue of hope. It's sort of the neglected virtue. Faith gets a lot of attention. Love gets an awful lot of attention. Of course, the word is abused. It's been degraded in its meaning. Sometimes people just mean feeling. They mean emotion. They don't mean real love, the volitional thing. the active willing of the other, of the good of the other for the sake of the other. But we need to pay more attention to the virtue of hope. As Cornel always says, hope's not optimism.
Yeah.
We're not optimistic,
Yeah.
but we are hopeful, and we're hopeful because we're believers. We know that the ultimate authority is not in our own hands. We human beings, if everything were up to us, we'd get it all wrong. Human nature and human history teach that lesson. We have hope in God. We have hope in a higher power. That's the basis of our hope. And we have looked at the end of the book and see how the story ends. And that enables us to have hope. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to be on a path of progress. People who think history is progressing in a positive direction, inevitably, who pick up that Hegelian Marxist dialectic of history, they are deeply misguided, and they are bound to be disappointed. You know, sometimes things go up and sometimes things go down. Sometimes things get morally better. Sometimes things get morally worse. Old vices come back in new forms. Just when you think you got them beat, in the grave, stake through the heart, they're back in a new form. It doesn't change. It is. So
Did you notice, though?
It might be a rocky road, but we know how the story ends, the triumph of Jesus, who's defeated death on the cross.
Now, did you notice his Kierkegaardian element of the unity of the Christian virtues, so that love and hope must have some gift of faith, which is a kind of small leap of faith. It may not be as thick as Kierkegaard, but even the legacy of Aquinas has that something that more than any kind of rational orientation, because hope is not a mood, it's not a feeling, it's not a calculation, it's a virtue. The virtue is something else.
See, as I said,
aspiration toward a disposition toward behaving relative to exactly what Brother Robbie just said. So all of a sudden, see how, Brother Scott, you brought this Kierkegaardian and this Thomistic, I mean, not just thoroughly Thomistic, but deeply influenced by Thomas Aquinas, even more together in his formulation as we come to a close here. It's been really quite a wonderful pilgrimage tonight.
I love it. And I
see,
hate
that shows you that verifies what I said earlier. See, we Catholics can learn from our Protestant brothers.
Well, we Protestants learn, we Protestants don't exist. I mean, Martin Luther himself, Augustinian monk.
Well, gentlemen, I hope, if nothing else, that this conversation tonight has given people hope. And what a fitting and perfect note to end on, Professor George, that I do hope, in a time where I think a lot of people really do feel hopeless and don't know what to do and are isolated from people around them and are in darkness, that this could provide some semblance of hope, that there's possibilities, that there's humanity, that there is reverence, that there's piety, as you said, for what came before and the people who are around us. And so I wish we could keep going in this conversation, but unfortunately the hour is late, especially for you two. I can't tell you how honored I am, again, to share a screen with you. You are both profoundly influential in my life. So thank you for your work and what you do and for being here. Thank you to all of you who are watching tonight and who've stayed with us, and all of you who might watch on YouTube later on. So if you want access to this video later on, it will be available on YouTube in the next couple of days at thomascenter.org/civil discourse. So we will have the recording available for people who couldn't be here. I want to give my special thanks to the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization, Thought, and Policy at CU, and the Center for Leadership, to Chancellor DiStefano, to Brian, who's been working very hard in the background of this entire event, to all the watch parties that are happening all over the place, and the students and all sorts of folks that are gathered. Thank you for being here. Professor West, Professor George, my profound and deep thanks on behalf of the University of Colorado and the Aquinas Institute and this whole community. Thank you again for being here and for doing this.
Thank you, Scott.
We thank you, though, brother.
And to all of you, good night, and thanks for tuning in.
Brother Robbie, stay strong, my brother.
Stay strong, Cornel. God bless
Give you
you.
a big hug. Give you a big hug.
Elbow bump.
Oh, that's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. It's elbow now. It's elbow now.